I bet this has happened to you at least once. You open your parachute and you start looking for the landing area. But after a couple of seconds, you realize I am never gonna make it. I'm too far from the drop zone. So instead of guessing if you're gonna make it or not, today I'm gonna tell you a better and a safer method that you can use to estimate if you're gonna make it or not inside of the landing zone. Let's go. So to apply this method, you need to know three things. The first one is called glide ratio. So that means how efficient your wing is. So the glide ratio is the ratio between horizontal and vertical distances that you're flying. So for example, if your wing is able to move 3 meters horizontally and 1 meter vertically, your glide ratio is 3:1. In this case, 3. But this number can be affected by multiple factors. Probably the most influential one is wind. So if you're flying upwind or downwind, this number is gonna change significantly. Let's imagine that this is you with your canopy and this is your target right here. If you're flying downwind, the wind of course is gonna help you move towards this point, and your glide ratio is gonna be higher because the horizontal component is gonna be helped by the wind itself. If you're flying upwind, this number is gonna be lower for the same reason. And this is thing number 2 that you have to know: how to measure the glide ratio. So basically you have multiple choices, but the easiest one is to get a GPS, for example the FlySight. If you don't know what that is a small device that you can put on your helmet, and probably you've seen in the past someone at your drop zone using this kind of device. You turn it on, you start recording, and when you land, you put the data inside of a simple software that's gonna give you all the information about your flight, and between all of those data, you can see the glide ratio. So that means that that kind of GPS is able to measure each second how far you move and how much distance you drop every seconds. For those of you who are gonna watch the video until the end, I'm gonna give you a quick tip on how you can measure the glide ratio without using a FlySight. And last but not least, you gotta know your drop zone and your area. So for example, if this is the drop zone, and each drop zone probably has a map that you can see where you have the top view of the surrounding area. So for example, if you have something like a highway, you have a lake, and you have, let's say, a stadium, for example, here with the track, the thing that you have to know at least once when you jump in a new drop zone is reference points. So this is your landing spot. All right, let's figure it out. How far is the lake? How far is the stadium? How far is the highway? If you have a couple of points, 3 maybe is better, and you know, okay, the distance between the highway and the drop zone is, I don't know, 1 mile. If you open close to the highway, and if you have the highway below you when you have your parachute open, you can tell, all right, I'm a mile from the drop zone. Same for each reference point that you have around your landing area. So know your glide ratio and measure it with a GPS like the FlySight, and understand the reference points around the drop zone. These are the things you have to know. Very easy stuff. All right, so let's see a real example. You open your parachute, you spot the drop zone, and what the first thing you have to do? First thing is check the altitude. And now what we do next? Guess what? We try to estimate where we are and how far we are from our target. so the landing area. Let's assume that we are on top of the highway, and of course, you know, because you prepare before boarding, that the highway is about 5,000 feet from the drop zone, all right? So that this distance is around 5,000 feet. Okay, so drop zone distance, and now it's time to apply that famous number that we call the glide ratio. So you open the parachute, and first thing, check your altitude. Let's assume that you are at 3,000 feet, all right? So 3,000 feet is your altitude. And how much distance can you travel with this kind of altitude? It's really simple. You've got to take this that you can read from your altimeter and multiply it by the glide ratio. It is as simple as this. So in this case, we will simulate that the glide ratio is equal to 2. So we have this vertical space and we have a glide ratio of 2. So what we do now is multiply these two numbers. All right, so we will have a potential distance that we can travel horizontally 3,000 times 2. So this distance is gonna be 6,000 feet. Okay, pretty simple math, but very effective. So when you know this number, you check your altitude and you figure it out if you're gonna make it or not. So I said we are about 5,000 feet from the DZ. Remember, this number could change significantly if we fly upwind or downwind, all right? Let's assume in this case we have no wind. So when we touch the ground, so the altitude is gonna be 0, we have traveled 6,000 feet horizontally. If we have 5,000 feet between the highway where we are now and the drop zone, math is pretty easy now. It's gonna be 6,000 minus 5,000. So we will end up with something around 1,000 feet of safety that we have before landing. So you can make some turns above the drop zone and land safely. So let's repeat the procedure. First thing to know is this number, and you can measure it using a GPS, a flight site, whatever. Remember that after you open the parachute, first thing to do is check the altitude. Second, estimate the distance. And third, multiply your altitude by the glide ratio and remove the distance that you have from the drop zone. It's as easy as that. If you end up in a situation where you don't have enough to make it inside of the landing zone, there are two things you can do. First is trying to figure it out if you have any kind of wind that can push you towards the landing zone. So, as I said before, you can extend this number by flying downwind. So if the wind pushes you, this distance is gonna get higher and higher. So you will end up with having a higher glide ratio. Second, if you have no wind, or even if you have wind but that's not enough, you've gotta start looking for a safe spot where to land, of course. So I hope this simple but useful guide can help you out if you find yourself in a situation where you don't know exactly if you're gonna make it or not inside of the landing area. So now, instead of guessing, you have a practical guide, and a very simple one, that you can use every time when you are in that kind of situation. So as I said before, for those of you who are still watching the video, this is how you measure the glide ratio without having any kind of GPS or weird stuff on your helmet. So you have the drop zone here. You're flying above this spot. Those are the hangars. So let's assume that you have 1,000 feet between the hangar and the drop zone. You are here and you have 3,000 feet of altitude. The only thing you have to know is how much altitude do I lose when I fly from here to here. Let's assume, to make it simpler, that we have no wind. So today is a very peaceful day at the drop zone and we have no wind from here to here, flying up or downwind, whatever. So glide ratio, as we said before, is the ratio between how far I can travel horizontally and how much altitude do I lose. So if from here to here I end up with 2,500 feet, that means that I lost 500 feet of altitude to make a horizontal distance of 1,000 feet. So pretty straightforward. Glide ratio is going to be 1,000 divided by 500. That means glide ratio is 2. So this is an empirical method, but it still works even if you don't have any kind of devices that can record the data. Find a distance you know exactly, like from hangar to the drop zone, and fly from point A to point B and check how much altitude you lost. Divide the horizontal distance by the altitude that you've lost, and that is going to be your glide ratio. Thank you for watching.